It's often noted that Marshall's epigrams can be grouped in a variety of ways and then interpreted. This can be done more or less artificially. For example, you could group the poems by length or by meter. Perhaps more meaningfully, you could group them by genre, loosely understood. Some would be invective, others would be praise poems, some will be cruel, others very sweet, others somewhere in between. All or most of these groupings will probably give a reader a new and interesting view on Marshall and his world. Of course, you could also simply read the poems in order and see if there is any sense to be made of different groups of consecutive poems. This has the virtue of giving us a glimpse into the poet's mind. After all, we can presume that he put them into a certain order for a certain reason. This isn't always possible for collections of ancient poetry, since we often have to reconstruct collections of poems from scraps that may or may not have been numbered, or we may not know why some Byzantine scribe put the poems into a given order in the first place. Happily, in Marshall's case, we believe that we actually have the poems in the order in which they were published. 1.43, 1.44, and 1.45 form one such triad. So let's see how they're all related. 1.43 has Marshall complaining about a cheap host, and it ends with a wish for the host to get thrown into the arena and killed by a boar. This is fitting because the cheap host, Mancinus, presented 60 of his dinner guests with a pig and made them watch him eat it. At first, 1.44 seems to take a different turn, and it has Marshall replying to Stella's complaint that Marshall is repeating himself by writing twice on the subject of the lion and the hare. These poems come earlier in the book. He answers the complaint by telling Stella that if this repetition seems too much for him, that he should put 2 hares on Marshall's plate. Marshall wrote to eat, so if Stella doesn't like it, he can feel free to give him a double portion of food. 1.45, a very short epigram, has Marshall praising the virtues of repetition. In just 2 lines he says, in so many words, quote, "So that my works do not perish by the shortness of my books, let me fill them up with repetitions like Homer." A literal translation of that last line would be something like, "Rather let it be said, and he replied to him." Those last 3 words are Greek, and they occur frequently in Homer whenever any one character replies to another character. So the idea is that Homer is filled with formulae that fill up the hexameter verse, so you get a lot of repetition. Ton de apamebomenos is one such formula. We can now see the irony. Marshall first complains that his host is providing a stingy meal, and really no meal at all. He's only giving them something to look at. Then Stella complains that Marshall is doing the same thing. That is, Marshall's epigrams are being stingy. When an author repeats himself, even if it's in slightly different words, there's really no more new material to consume. The only thing that this repetition achieves is to present something to the eyes. Only presentation, nothing new of substance, just like what Mancinus did with his boar. Then, in 1.45, Marshall retorts that it's better for his books to be repetitive and remembered than short and forgotten. Now, what could be more memorable than asking 60 people to your house to watch you eat? So perhaps the stingy Mancinus and the repetitive Marshall are not so different after all. Both are using mere presentation without substance. In Marshall's case, we know that it's explicitly because he wants to be remembered, although we are only left to guess after the motives of Mancinus. There may also be a subtle joke here. If Mancinus deserves to be thrown to a boar because he's stingy, then what kind of treatment does Marshall's stinginess and repetition merit? Now, the really cool part is that each of these epigrams could be just as reasonably grouped and examined with other non-consecutive epigrams or groups of poems. For example, 1.43 could be put together with 120, where a crowd has gathered to see a man eat mushrooms. 1.44 could be grouped with all the other hare and lion poems. And 1.45 could be grouped with all the other epigrams in Book 1, where Marshall uses Greek. Let's think about the reading habits of any literate group of people. When you take a book of poetry, do you read it cover to cover? Do you skip around? Do you take it with you to the bathroom? I think that we all do all of these things. Marshall seems to have constructed his book to appeal to many different kinds of readers. The man who reads epigrams on the toilet, and the man who sits down and reads the book cover to cover. There's plenty meaning to find, no matter how you choose to read the book. In the past, I've turned up my nose at the idea that any poem or group of poems could be inexhaustible, that they can keep giving you new meaning at every turn forever. I still think that's a little implausible, but it's certainly true that for Marshall, we've been given the ability to rearrange his epigrams in many, many different ways and come up with new perspectives that seem to be valid and warranted by the evidence we have in the epigrams. If you've enjoyed this audio commentary, please download the text versions of these 3 epigrams. They are linked in the description. Hit subscribe if you'd like to see more, and if you'd really like to help out, visit my Patreon at patreon.com/Homeric Dialect. Thanks for watching. See you next time.